Just as an introduction to this next bracha, this next blessing, it's the restoration of judges, qualified judges who are above reproach integrity-wise. Why is this such an essential supplication that the court system should be reinstated and reestablished to have the most qualified judges to adjudicate the various laws or cases? We find at the beginning of creation, when God created the world, he initially wanted to create the world with the attribute of justice. And then because he saw man is prone to fail, he had to coalesce the attribute of mercy, because without the attribute of mercy, the world couldn't continue, could not exist. Because the moment the person should fail or transgress, God will rain in on him immediately. And if that is the case, there's not much hope for the future. So therefore, understanding the nature of the human being, God coalesced into the system the attribute of mercy. Therefore, we find when the human being was created, Adam was created, the appellation of God is no longer Elokim, it's Hashem Elokim. Yud Kei Vav Kei Elokim, which represents the attribute of mercy. Now, why did God want initially? Firstly, let's understand. Just Bereshis Bara Elokim. In the beginning, Elokim created. Vayomer Elokim, first day of creation. Elokim said, Ye are. Let there be light. Second day, Elokim said, every day it's Elokim. When it comes to the creation of the human being, it's Hashem Elokim. I mean, human being, we understand the attribute of justice or mercy, that's evaluation. Do I give you a chance? Don't give me a chance. But what relevance does Elokim, the attribute of justice, have to do with creation of the inanimate? Light, the water should gather, vegetation, species of animals, all this. What relevance does that have to do with the attribute of justice? So we had explained that what is midas hadin? What is the attribute of justice? Precision, exacting. That's what the attribute of justice. God is exacting. When God is exacting, that means everything has to be addressed immediately. Creation is exact. It was created with perfection, with precision. There's nothing superfluous in existence. That is the context of the attribute of justice. As justice is precise and exacting, creation came about through that attribute of God as being exacting. So if you use the same yardstick in the creation of the human being that God is exacting, man doesn't have a chance to survive. That since man, the human being, is prone to fail, because the human being is given the additional component, which is called free choice. Man will choose to do as he chooses. And unfortunately, those choices aren't necessarily conducive or directing or engendering or promoting spirituality. Therefore, God had to coalesce into the creation of man or into all existence the attribute of mercy, because existence only exists to facilitate the objective of the human being. So if the human being is prone to fail, and we have to give him a chance or many chances, whether it's to do tshuva or to do other good deeds, therefore the attribute of mercy was coalesced. But initially the intent, even for the human being, was the attribute of justice, exacting. Why? Why is the attribute of justice such a valuable and important attribute? Because if you want to have a perfect world and you want things to evolve and develop and to function as they're meant to, then you have to have exactness. You have to have the attribute of justice. Justice will keep people in check. However, if the reality is that man, despite that, is going to fail, there's no point. Ultimately, you're not going to have a world, because most humanity who fails will actually be taken out of the system. Therefore, since the objective of creation is the human being, God had no choice to be able to achieve what he's interested in achieving. He had to introduce the attribute of mercy. But why is the concept of exacting such a valuable concept? Because you're able to achieve a more perfect result than something which, when you have the attribute of mercy. That's the concept. So what did God do? God just didn't forego the attribute of justice. He says, although there will not be divine justice, and from the divine location, there'll be mercy, but on the human level, there has to be justice. And therefore, even the Noahide laws, one of the Noahide laws is setting up a judicial system. You must have courts, judges to adjudicate and to ensure and enforce the laws that are on the books. You know, there's a famous question which is asked by the Maral of Prague. If you notice, every one of the Noahide laws are all negative commandments. Don't do this, don't do that. Thou shalt not kill. Adultery, incest, eating a limb off a living animal, idolatry, blasphemy. These are all Noahide laws. Basically, behaving like a civilized human being and believing in God. But there's one of the 7 Noahide laws is a positive commandment. Establish a judicial system. 6 of the 7 are negative. One of them is positive. Establishing a judicial system, a body of people which will ensure that the laws are abided by and the laws are kept. So he explains that a non-Jew has no relevance to spiritual advancement. Spiritual advancement is determined through positive commandments. A non-Jew is given a spirituality which is not the same dimension as a Jew, and his responsibility is to maintain what he was given, and when he passes away, he should return that same soul as it was endowed to him. And how does he guarantee that it will be pretty much in its original form? Don't cross these lines. And if you don't cross those lines, you'll remain basically intact. What is the positive commandment? The positive commandment of the judicial system is to ensure that the 6 other Noahide laws are actually kept. That's what the positive commandment of establishing a judicial system is, to guarantee that the laws that have to be kept are kept. And if not, there's going to be punishment. That's what it is. But there has to be law and order. There has to be a judicial system. Why? Because without a judicial system, without the attribute of justice minimally on the terrestrial level, man is prone to go in every direction. Man is prone to do as he chooses to do. So how do you somehow control this independent behavior? That every person is committed to himself and he justifies every level of behavior due to his own conflict of interest. How do you somehow control that? The judicial system. Because if there's accountability and the court will enforce the consequences of that accountability, people are going to behave themselves. And you have to have, although God says divine justice would actually destroy the world, but minimally you need some level of justice to guarantee that the world functions within the context, within a framework, within parameters which allow the world to function as it's meant to function. Although there's no divine justice, there must be human justice. But what happens if you have a court system where the judges are corrupt and they're dishonest and they're not qualified? If that's the case, not only don't you have a divine justice, but you don't even have human justice. So if that's the case, the world is going in every direction. There's no unified format and constructive formula to maintain humanity. And if that happens, it's the beginning of the end. You have to have human justice. You have to have a court system. And this is what God says. If there's no human justice, the only reason why I forewent divine justice is because the world can't continue to exist. Because divine justice means it's brutal, it's exacting. Human justice is based on the laws that are legislated, promulgated by the court to ensure those 6 Noahide laws are maintained. So there is a semblance of what? Of order. But if even that semblance of order doesn't exist, the world cannot function to any degree. It's called chaos. It's called anarchy. Therefore, God says, if that ever happens, God says, I have no choice but to assert myself, and there's going to be divine justice. And if there's no human justice, there has to be divine justice. Because the human justice, which is terrestrial level, is only to maintain it at a level so man should be able to tolerate that justice. But if even that justice, that order is not set in place, there's divine justice. And if there's divine justice, the world will be destroyed or be punished or hurt very badly. And the Chazal say, the Midrash says, Im yesh din lamato, if there's justice below on the terrestrial, ain din lamalo, then there's no divine justice. But if there's no din lamato, if there's no human justice, then there'll be divine justice. Now, with that, we're able to understand there's a certain passage in the Gemara. The Gemara says that a judge who is corrupt, talking about a Jewish judge who's corrupt, even for as much as rendering a verdict, a ruling, which causes a person to be victimized, even for one penny, God says, I will take the soul of that judge. And cites a verse. He's liable to be put to death. God will take his soul. But God says, but the judge who rules with integrity and with truth, God says, that judge is my partner in creation. Two sides of the equation. If he's corrupt even for 1 cent, God says, I will take his soul. But if he's a man of integrity and every verdict is above reproach and truthful, God says, he is my partner in creation. So there's a question to be asked. A person embezzles $10 million. He's not liable. God doesn't say, I will take his soul. He has liability. He's a thief. He has to return the money to the one he victimized. But God doesn't say he's going to take his soul. But the judge who renders a decision which is not truthful, and as a result of that, one person loses as little as a cent, God says, I will take his soul. That's how extreme that failing is. That's how serious that transgression is. The question is why? So based on what we just said, we understand it. God says, if there's human justice, there's no divine justice. There's no need for divine justice because there's order. It's called law and order. Did you ever think why it's called law and order? It's called law because law allows there should be order. If there's order, the world functions. There's no law, there's no order. There's no order, it's chaos, it's anarchy. God says, I have to step into the equation. If God steps into the equation, which is divine justice, the world will suffer plenty. Because divine justice, there's no mercy. There's no mercy on God's point, where he's coming from, there's endless suffering. But who's responsible for that suffering? You know who? The judge who's corrupt. The judge who's corrupt, who doesn't render an honest decision, he's the cause. He activates divine justice. Therefore, it's not just a man is being victimized for a penny. The corrupt judge, he's breached the system. There's no order. There's no justice on the terrestrial level. So for not behaving responsibly on the terrestrial level, you're the cause that there's divine justice. If there's divine justice, all the suffering in the world, whether it's illness, death, or whatever else may be, upheavals, who's the one who caused that? Who's responsible? The judge who was corrupt. Therefore, God says, I will take his soul. But the judge who rules a ruling, a verdict beyond reproach, with the ultimate level of integrity, God says, he's my partner in creation. Because why does God not intervene with divine justice? Because this man is rendering truthful decisions, verdicts. So therefore, why does existence exist? Because of the honest judge. Therefore, the honest judge is God's partner in creation. Because existence functions as it's meant to function due to the honesty, integrity of the honest judge who's not corrupt for that reason. Now we understand when a person offers a bribe to a judge, there's a negative commandment. You're not permitted to take bribery. And even a favor is bribery. Because the moment a person allows himself to take bribery or to be subject to some kind of favor, it creates a certain conflict of interest, even on a subconscious level, that the person loses his level of impartiality, and that causes him not to be qualified to be a judge. Because you have to have a certain level of clarity. Now, it's interesting. According to Jewish law, the evidence is only two qualified judges. Anything less than two qualified witnesses. Anything less than two qualified witnesses is not considered evidence, according to Judaism. Whether it's monetary, whether it's marriage, divorce, or whether it's conviction to convict a person for corporal punishment, you have to have two qualified witnesses. And if they're not two male qualified witnesses, they're not qualified to testify. Now, witnesses, before they testify, before we rely on that evidence to render a verdict, the witnesses have to undergo interrogation. They have to be asked very specific questions. And if they don't respond properly, they're disqualified. If one witness responds properly and the other, and we find this discrepancy in the responses of the two witnesses, they're both disqualified. We can't accept it. To be credible, they have to undergo this interrogation, and they have to respond as expected by the court. And if they don't respond as the court would want them to respond, they're disqualified. Okay? Now, two witnesses come and say, Reuven killed Shimon, committed murder. And we forewarned him. A person who transgresses certain laws and they're forewarned, liable for the death penalty. Okay? Now, the court is not just going to rely on the testimony of these two witnesses. They interrogate them. They ask them many questions. Where did it happen? How did it happen? When did it happen? What day of the month? What day of the week? Was it in the morning? Was it in the afternoon? There are many questions they ask. And if all the answers, the court is satisfied with the answers, that's called credible evidence. And based on that evidence, they offer a verdict. The so-called murderer will be put to death. And they put him to death. Okay? Let's see what happens. What happens after the witnesses testify and they were interrogated, the court renders a verdict, two other witnesses come, credible witnesses, they say. The witness who's testified that Reuven killed Shimon, the so-called accused murderer, they couldn't have witnessed that act of murder because they were with us elsewhere, so they couldn't have witnessed what they claimed they witnessed. The law is, we believe the latter group and the first two witnesses are taken out. This is pre-death penalty, before the person's put to death. These other witnesses come, post-verdict, and the Torah says the two witnesses who conspired to take a life of an innocent person, they are put to death. That's called kashizomamas. As you conspired to do to your brother, that will be done to you. And that's the law. So now the question is, so if we see that the system is not foolproof, because even after two witnesses, credible witnesses testify, they undergo this very thorough interrogation, no discrepancies. And the court are people of caliber, qualified, and they feel that the witnesses are telling the truth, and they render a verdict. And yet, it's possible two other witnesses come and say, you know something, they rehearsed it, they did it so well, but factually they lied because they couldn't have witnessed that murder because they were elsewhere with us. They said, we don't know if the murder took place, but they definitely did not witness it because they were with us elsewhere. We put them to death. So we see the system's not a foolproof system. So how does the Torah allow you to take a life of an individual, which there's nothing as valuable as a life, based on the testimony of two witnesses, because we see that after everything's said and done, the system's not foolproof. How do we do it? So the answer is very simple. The Talmud quotes a pasuk in Tehillim. It says, Elokim nitza badas keil. When the court convenes, a credible court, and they meet all the criteria, which is the basis for a verdict, God convenes with that group of judges. He convenes. And the judges, when they render that verdict, they see it through God's eyes. God endows them with a clarity. So when they ruled guilty, it's because God wanted them to be guilty. That's the Gemara. Elokim nitza badas keil. Elokim, the one who's the ultimate attribute of justice. God Almighty, who's the God of justice. He convenes with the court, and therefore it's impossible they made a mistake. Based on the evidence they received, it's credible evidence, he's put to death. But he's found innocent, because later we find out the witnesses were conspiring. The answer is, if the person was found guilty, and let's say he would have been killed, he may have not been guilty for that crime, which the witnesses had testified that he committed. But if ultimately he was put to death, you know why he was put to death? Because God wanted him to be put to death. Because no verdict which meets the criteria of what a court is not subject to God's intervention and God endowing them with a clarity that the man should be found guilty. So even though he may have not been guilty for this particular crime, but the reason why he forfeited his life is because God wanted to forfeit his life. Therefore, years ago, we used to debate when we were kids in school, when there was a question of the death penalty, should they actually retract it? Capital punishment, should it continue or should not continue? Because you could put an innocent man to death. Within the context of the Jewish judicial system, the Torah judicial system, the question is not a question. It's impossible to put an innocent man to death. Because even if he's found, it's turned out he's not guilty for this particular crime, that he was put to death is because God wanted him to die in the manner that he did die. And give you some background on this. The Talmud tells us that although today we don't have a court who could put anybody to death, because you have to have a certain level of certification. You have to have a certain level of ordination. You have to be ordained by Moshe Rabbeinu. But even though the court cannot implement and execute within the realm of the 4 death penalties, but they're all still in effect. For instance, a person deserves stoning. What was stoning in the time of the Sanhedrin? A person would be taken and put on an elevated platform, the equivalent of his height. And he'd have his hands tied behind his back, and he would have his feet tied together. And they put him on this elevated location, and then they push him off backwards. When he falls backwards and he can't brace his fall, what happens to him? He breaks his neck. Instantaneous death. That was stoning. So what is stoning? After that would happen, they would take a large stone and put it on his chest. That's considered stoning, but not they pummeled him with stones. The way you see the Al-Qaeda, the way or wherever it is, ISIS, the way they put people to death, they stone people because the body remains intact. He breaks his neck, dies most times, and if there's any life, that stone will actually cause him to totally expire. That's what it is. So today we have no court to implement that kind of penalty. So how does it happen today? You know what happens? A person falls off a roof. A person falls off a roof and he falls to his death. That is the equivalent of stoning. So although the court didn't implement that death penalty, it's in effect. A person was supposed to die through strangulation. It's one of the levels of death penalty. Today we have no court. So how does that person die? He dies through drowning. Drowning is asphyxiation. Or he dies through smoke inhalation. Smoke inhalation is asphyxiation. That is the equivalent of that death penalty. If a person was meant to die through burning, burning, according to Jewish law, is not you don't burn the body because you're not permitted to destroy the body. They would take molten lead and they would pour it down his throat, which was instantaneous death. That was burning. They would burn his insides. His insides would be burnt. So today that we don't have that procedure in the court, the person is bitten by a venomous snake. And when he's bitten by that venomous snake, the poison, the venom goes through his bloodstream, and within moments, he dies. That's the equivalent of what? That a person who's meant to die through dying by the sword, he's captured by bandits, and they decapitate him, or they run him through with a sword. So although the actual procedure of the death penalty is no longer in effect, but the equivalent of that is in effect. Because again, as we always say, God always gets his man, regardless. God always gets his man. So therefore, the court that puts the person to death, although later it's found out that he was not guilty for that particular crime, because other witnesses came and testified that the witnesses were conspiring, but the man who was put to death was a guilty man. He was guilty. He may have not been guilty for the crime, so there's no such thing as capital punishment, the right thing or the wrong thing. Because if the person ultimately is put to death, when you meet the criteria, it's because God wanted that person to die. That's what it's all about. So you need the court, when it rules on the terrestrial level, justice, God is involved in that justice. That's also God's justice. So if there's justice on the terrestrial level, there's no divine justice, because divine justice is without mercy. So the judge who acts responsibly, with a conscience, with integrity, knowing the laws, he maintains the world. Because of him and his rulings and his conscience and his integrity, there is no divine justice. God says that man is my partner's creation. But if the judge is corrupt and there is no justice on the terrestrial level, God says, you're the cause that there has to be divine justice. Therefore, you have a level of culpability which is unforgiving, and therefore, I will take your soul. Because all the suffering in the world is due to people like yourself, because you're not living up to where you should be, assuming the responsibility. Therefore, I will take your soul. Now we could understand this is the background, that's the next blessing. We're in exile. The Talmud says in Shabbos, why was Jerusalem destroyed? Of course, the courts was corrupt. Because the courts were corrupt, that's why Yerushalayim was destroyed, and ultimately the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Meaning, we deserved for many reasons to be exiled. But we have many contributing reasons. But what weakened the foundation? What literally dislodged us from what we call the Holy Land, from the location which is God's location? Because the court system did not behave properly. They were corrupted judges. So due to the corrupted judges, we were exiled. Meaning, they were the cause of the ultimate level of divine justice. Divine justice doesn't tolerate a lot of things. Once there's divine justice, even if you steal, you deserve to be put out, even to be killed on a divine level. So therefore, we pray to God, Hashiva Shofteinu K'Rishono, restore our judges as initially the judges of that integrity, who rule with conscience, who are responsible, and no case is too small or too large to adjudicate, and even something which has almost infinitesimal value, they don't take less seriously than a case of greater value. Makes no difference. Of course, what is the issue? The issue is implementing justice. And we as judges have that responsibility to be judges of integrity, qualified. The Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us in one location, there used to be the political system in New York City in the 20s, which was corrupt. It was run by gangsters. It was called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall. And they were all corrupt. The politicians were corrupt. The judges were corrupt. Everything was payoff. You understand? It's disastrous. That's what it is. And that's what it was at the time before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Things were out of control at every level. But once the judicial system, God signaled his truth. Once that was no longer in place, God says it's over. If the world does not function within the context of truth and justice, orderliness, as I said, it's law and order. If there's no law, there's no order. You have to have order. We know anything which is constructive functions within an order. There's no order, it's a disarray. I added to this myself. I said, a Jew has an obligation to give his fellow the benefit of the doubt. And it's a positive commandment. It says, B'tzedek tishpot es abisecho. Judge your fellow with righteousness. That if you have a 50-50 call, you see something, and you judge your fellow negatively or positively, you have an obligation to judge him positively. The man has a presumed status, he's not an honest person. And you see him do something. And you have a question, what direction is it? How should it be evaluated, positive or negative? You have an obligation, b'tzedek tishpot es abisecho. You must judge him with righteousness, as a righteous person. So we see not only within the context of the court system, the judicial system, do we actually actualize this concept of law and order, even among fellows, one to the other. We're actually meeting that criteria of law and order of the judicial system. Because it's the way the Torah expresses, b'tzedek tishpot, judge your fellow with righteousness. And what happens if we don't? That means everybody sees everybody else totally corrupt. If everybody sees one another in a corrupt perspective, reality, then it's survival of the fittest. There's no law and there's no order. Therefore, you have to give your fellow the benefit of the doubt and judge him favorably that there is order. The person is behaving and is controlled and is acting responsibly.